The stars didn't used to frighten us. There was a time, not so long ago, measured against the deep calendar of the universe, when we looked up at the night sky and felt only wonder, only hunger, only the clean, bright ache of a species that had not yet learned what waited out there in the dark between suns. We were wrong to be unafraid. But here is the thing about humans, the thing the galaxy took too long to understand. We were also wrong to stay that way. Her name was Dara Osimensa, and she was 34 years old, and she was about to walk into the most important room in the known galaxy wearing shoes that were half a size too small. That detail matters. Remember it. She stood at the end of a corridor on the station called Veth Primaris, a structure so large that its central hub generated its own weather patterns, where clouds formed against the interior ceiling 3 kilometers above the trading floors, where 17 species conducted the business of civilization under artificial suns that never set and never rose, only burned at a steady, neutral, politically agreed-upon brightness that offended no one's biology. The corridor she stood in was called the Approach. Every delegation that came to petition the compact walked it. The floor was polished to a mirror finish, a composite material that the Vethrani had been manufacturing for 400 years, harder than any substance humans had yet synthesized. It reflected everything. It reflected Dara. 5 feet 6 inches, dark skin, natural hair pulled back with 3 small silver clasps she had owned since she was 12, a formal suit the color of deep water, a data tablet tucked under her left arm, and behind her, 47 other humans walking in measured formation. 47 humans. That was the entire delegation. The Serathi had sent 900. To understand what was happening, you need to understand what the compact was. Not in the diplomatic language, not in the careful, translated, triple-reviewed language that appeared in official communications, but in plain terms. The compact was the agreement, the one that mattered. It had been written 412 years ago by 7 species who had, after a century of intermittent warfare, decided that the cost of fighting each other was higher than the cost of compromise. They had gathered on Veth Primaris, which was itself a neutral structure, constructed jointly, owned by no single species, and they had hammered out a document that established trade rights, territorial limits, mutual defense obligations, and, crucially, the terms under which new species could be admitted to full membership. Those terms were not simple. They were not meant to be. 7 species, each with their own history of betrayal and alliance, had designed the admission process to be slow, demanding, and exhaustive. A new species seeking membership had to demonstrate continuous civilized contact with existing members for no fewer than 60 years. It had to maintain what the compact called cultural coherence, a contested term that had been the subject of 1,100 years of legal argument across all of its recognized governing bodies. It had to pass a capability review, demonstrating that it possessed the technological and organizational capacity to meet its obligations as a member. And finally, it had to stand before the full council and make its case. Humanity had been making contact with compact species for 63 years. Humanity had submitted its petition for full membership 17 months ago. And 3 weeks before the scheduled hearing, the Serathi had filed a challenge. The Serathi were old. Not in the way that humans use the word, not the way we call a building old, or a tradition old, but old in the geological sense. Their civilization had been continuous for over 40,000 years. They remembered the formation of the compact the way humans remember the invention of writing, technically within recorded history, but so far back that it felt like mythology. They were tall, bilaterally asymmetrical in ways that remained subtly unsettling even after years of contact, with a communication system that layered subaudible harmonics beneath speech that conveyed emotional context with a precision that made human body language look like finger painting. They were not cruel. That's important to say. They were not acting out of malice. They simply did not believe humanity was ready. Their challenge cited three specific points. First, that humanity's political fragmentation, multiple independent governing bodies across Earth and 14 colony worlds, meant it could not demonstrate cultural coherence as defined by the original charter. Second, that human technology, while advancing rapidly, had not yet reached the threshold required by the capability review, specifically in faster-than-light communication infrastructure. And third, and this was the one that landed like a stone in still water, they argued that humanity's historical pattern of internal conflict disqualified it under a clause that had not been invoked in 230 years. The War Clause. The Serathi were arguing, in the measured and impeccably sourced language of 4,000 years of legal scholarship, that humanity was too dangerous to let in. Dara had been given this case 11 months ago. She was not the most famous human diplomat. She was not the most senior. She was not, by several reasonable metrics, the obvious choice. She was chosen because 6 months before the petition was filed, she had been the lead negotiator in a trade dispute between a human mining consortium and a Vithrani resource collective. A dispute that had been ongoing for 9 years, and that 3 previous negotiating teams had failed to resolve. And she had resolved it in 4 days. She had not resolved it through charm, exactly, though she was charming. She had not resolved it through threats. She had resolved it by spending 3 months before the negotiation reading every document both sides had ever produced about the dispute. Not the summaries, not the briefings, but the original documents in the original languages, with translators who were instructed to give her the literal meaning, not the diplomatic meaning and finding, buried in records that neither side had looked at in 40 years, a provision in the original mining charter that both sides had been misreading due to a translation error that was itself 80 years old. She had walked into that negotiation knowing something neither side knew. She had not announced it dramatically. She had simply, at the correct moment, placed the document on the table. That was Dara. In the 3 weeks between the Serathi challenge and the hearing, she slept an average of 4 hours a night. Her team, a constitutional lawyer named Dr. Amara Akafer, a linguist, a xenocultural historian, 2 communication specialists, and a woman named Priya Vasantha who officially held the title of administrative coordinator and unofficially held everything together through some combination of organizational genius and caffeine, worked in shifts around the clock in their assigned quarters on Veth Primaris, 3 corridors down from the Serathi delegation's much larger, much better appointed suite of rooms. The Serathi challenge was strong. Dara read it 4 times before she began to respond to it, and each time she felt the same thing, a cold respect for the quality of the argument. They had done this before, not to humanity but to others. In the past 2 millennia, the Serathi had filed challenges against 6 other species seeking admission. 3 had been upheld, 2 had been withdrawn by the petitioning species themselves, which amounted to the same thing. Only 1 had been successfully rebutted. Only 1 species had ever beaten a Serathi challenge. That was the Kurath, 200 years ago. And the Kurath had won by the narrowest possible margin, a single deciding vote from the Vithrani delegation, cast by a counselor who, according to historical record, had spent the preceding 8 hours in closed consultation with the human equivalent of a spiritual advisor, and whose stated reasoning for her vote had been, when translated as precisely as possible, they argued well. That was what Dara was working with. precedent, fragile and ancient, that the quality of argument could be enough. She began with the cultural coherence point because it was the one she was least worried about, and she had a principle. Deal with what you're confident about first, and let the work itself build momentum. The Serathi argument was that humanity's multiple governing bodies made it impossible to speak of a single culture with coherent values. Dr. Akaffer had already identified the weakness in this argument before Dara had even asked her to look, because Akaffer was that kind of lawyer, which was that the original Compact Charter's definition of cultural coherence had been written when all 7 founding species happened to have unified planetary governments. The definition assumed unity of governance because its authors could not fully imagine the alternative. But the definition itself did not require it. It required, in the precise original language, and here was where the linguist became essential, continuity of foundational ethical commitments across the recognized governing body or bodies of the petitioning species. The or bodies was the key. It was 2 words, or, in the Vithrani original, something closer to a single syllable, that the Serathi's legal team had glossed over in their challenge, either because they didn't consider it significant or because they were betting that the council wouldn't notice. Dara considered it significant. She spent 12 days building the documentation, a comprehensive survey of humanity's foundational ethical commitments as expressed in governing documents, legal traditions, and treaty obligations across every independent human governing body, on Earth and on every colony world. It was not a small task. Human civilization, even unified in its aspiration toward space, remained spectacularly diverse in language, custom, religion, political philosophy, and aesthetic preference. But underneath that diversity, if you looked at the foundational documents, the constitutions and charters and compacts that each human society had written to define itself to itself, there were threads. There were commitments that recurred independently across cultures that had developed in isolation from each other, that had come to similar conclusions about similar things. The dignity of the individual, the obligation of the powerful to account for the exercise of power, the duty of the living to the future, not identical across all traditions, not even close to identical, but recognizably related. The same idea appearing in 1,000 dialects. When Akaffer presented this argument before the council on day 1 of the hearing, standing before the tiered gallery where representatives of 22 species observed in silence, she did not dress it up. She stated it flatly, sourced it completely, and sat down. The Serathi legal team's response when it came was polished and thorough and argued from a different interpretation of cultural coherence, one that emphasized institutional unity over ethical continuity. It was a good argument, but it required the council to accept a definition that was not in the original text. The technology challenge was harder. The Compact's capability review required, among other things, demonstrated capacity for what the Charter called instantaneous communication across the full recognized territory of the petitioning species. Humanity had faster-than-light communication, relay networks that connected Earth to the colonies, but instantaneous was not quite accurate. The fastest signals took between 4 and 9 minutes depending on relay positioning. The Serathi argued this fell short of the threshold. This one kept Dara up. She walked the corridors of Veth Primaris at 2 in the morning, station time, while the artificial suns burned at their neutral brightness and the corridors were nearly empty, thinking about it. The problem was not that the argument was wrong. The problem was that the argument might be right. Humanity's communication infrastructure was good. It was advancing. But it was not, by the most precise technical definition, instantaneous. She could argue that the threshold had not been consistently applied, and it hadn't. The Serathi's own communication network at the time of the founding had not met the instantaneous standard by the strictest interpretation. They had argued at the time that their network exceeded all practical communication needs of their territory, and the Council had accepted that argument. Two other founding species had similar records, so Dara's argument became the standard as applied, not the standard as literally stated. Every species admitted to the compact had been evaluated on practical sufficiency, not theoretical perfection. Humanity's network met every practical communication need of human civilization. To hold humanity to a stricter standard than founding members had been held to was not the application of the Charter. It was the selective application of the Charter. It was a clean argument. It was, she believed, a winning argument. But it required the Council to look carefully at compact history. It required them to review records that were centuries old. It required them, in other words, to do work. She made it easy for them. Her team assembled a complete historical analysis. Every species capability review, every determination, every stated reasoning going back 400 years, and presented it as a single document, cross-referenced, searchable in 18 languages, with a summary no longer than 2 pages. The summary's first sentence was, "No species has ever been held to a stricter standard than founding members." Its second sentence was, "The record is complete and attached." The war clause was different. The war clause existed because the founders had not been naive. They had all survived wars. Some of them had survived wars with each other. They understood that a species capable of contributing to mutual defense was also a species capable of causing the kind of damage that the compact existed to prevent. And so they had written, in careful language, a provision that allowed the Council to delay admission for any species whose demonstrated pattern of internal and external conflict suggested that full membership would introduce unacceptable instability. It had been used twice before Dara's case, once to delay the admission of a species that was, at the time of application, in the middle of an active civil war. That one was uncontroversial. Once to delay the admission of the Kurath. That one had been controversial enough that it nearly broke the compact apart. The Serathi's application of the war clause to humanity was elegant and devastating. They did not argue that humanity was currently at war. They argued that humanity's historical record, 2 world wars, 112 smaller wars in the 20th century alone, the colony conflicts of the early expansion period, demonstrated a pattern that the war clause was designed to flag. They presented this not as an accusation but as a data analysis. Here are the events. Here are the casualties. Here is what the Charter says. We are not saying humanity is evil. We are saying the data is what it is. Dara read the Serathi brief 3 times in one night, and then she put it down and sat very still for a long time, and then she called Priya. Priya came. She sat down across from Dara in their small, neutral-colored meeting room with its view of the interior of the station, the kilometers of structure above them, the distant artificial suns, and she said nothing, because she knew Dara didn't need her to say anything yet. After a long time, Dara said, "They're not wrong about the data," and Priya said, "No." And Dara said, "So how do we answer it?" Priya thought about this. Then she said, "The same way you answered the mining dispute. You find what they didn't read." What Dara found over the next 4 days was not a single document. It was a pattern. She had asked the linguist and the xenocultural historian to approach the war clause challenge from an unexpected angle, not to dispute the historical record and not to minimize the conflicts, but to look at what happened after each one. What they found was this. Every major human conflict in recorded history, everyone without exception, had been followed by a period of institutional reconstruction. Treaties, courts, international bodies, mechanisms designed to prevent the recurrence of what had just happened. Some of these mechanisms had failed. Some had failed spectacularly. But humans had kept building them, kept revising them, kept trying to construct, out of the aftermath of violence, something that would hold. The League of Nations had failed. The United Nations had been imperfect and contested and sometimes cynically manipulated. But it had also, across 150 years of operation, prevented some number of conflicts that would otherwise have occurred, a number that could not be precisely calculated, because you could not count wars that didn't happen, but that the historical modeling suggested was not small. After the colony conflicts, humanity had built the Interstellar Governance Accord. It had taken 11 years and 3 failed drafts. It was not perfect, but it had held for 38 years, and in those 38 years there had been no conflict between colony worlds. The pattern was not, humanity makes war. The pattern was, humanity makes war, and then humanity, with every resource it has, tries to build something that will prevent the next one. It was not a perfect record. It was not a clean record. It was a record of a species that had looked at its own worst impulses and decided, repeatedly, across centuries, to try to be better. Dara wrote the argument herself. She wrote it in one sitting at 3 in the morning in the small hours between one artificial day and the next, while the station hummed around her and her team slept in shifts, and the shoes she'd bought for the formal hearing sat by the door, too tight, half a size off. She wrote, "We do not dispute the data. We present the complete data." She wrote, "The war clause was designed to protect the compact from species that are unreflective about their violence. The clause does not name peace as the threshold. It names demonstrated pattern. And humanity's demonstrated pattern, the complete pattern, is not violence followed by more violence. It is violence followed, consistently, by the construction of new tools to limit violence." She wrote, "We ask the Council not to evaluate humanity by the scale of its worst moments. We ask them to evaluate humanity by what we have done with our worst moments." She wrote, at the end, "We are not a species that has made peace. We are a species that has never stopped trying to make peace, and that is not the same thing, and we believe the Charter recognizes the difference." The hearing lasted 11 days. The council chamber of Veth Primaris was one of the most imposing spaces humans had ever stood in, a vast, domed structure that could seat 12,000 observers, though the working sessions were attended by far fewer, the empty upper tiers rising into shadow above the active delegations. The petitioners stood in the chamber's well, a circular space at the lowest level, open on all sides, surrounded by the tiered galleries where council members sat, and when Dara stood there, she was aware of being observed from every angle simultaneously. There was nowhere to hide in the chamber's well. That was by design. The Serathi presented first, 900 delegates, in their formal attire, their subaudible harmonics carrying something that Dara could not hear but could feel as a kind of atmospheric pressure. Their lead speaker was an individual named Ves Caliph, who had been practicing interspecies law for longer than the oldest human institution had existed, and who spoke with the kind of absolute, unhurried confidence that comes from knowing you have never lost a case before this council. Dara stood at the back of the gallery and listened to all of it. On day 2, Dr. Akaffer presented the cultural coherence rebuttal. On day 5, the communications specialist presented the capability review historical analysis. On day 8, Dara stood in the chamber's well and presented the war clause argument herself. She had memorized it. Not because she had to. The documentation was all available, all sourced, all projected on the chamber's display surfaces. but because she had decided that this particular argument needed to be delivered by a human, standing alone in that space from memory, making eye contact with the council members she could see and speaking toward the ones she couldn't. She stood in the well for 4 silent seconds before she began, which she had been told was unusual. Petitioners typically began speaking immediately. She used those 4 seconds to look up at the tiers, to let the silence exist, to let the chamber understand that she knew where she was and what she was doing. Then she said, "I want to tell you something true about my species." And she told them. She spoke for 90 minutes. She did not use notes. She did not rush. She let the argument build the way she had built it on paper, brick by brick, giving the council time to follow each step before taking the next one. She cited dates and documents and casualty figures and institutional histories. She named the failures honestly. She did not soften them, did not explain them away, did not ask for understanding she hadn't earned. She named them, and then she named what came after them. When she finished, the chamber was quiet for a long moment. Then a Kurath council member, one of the species that had once beaten a Serathi challenge 200 years ago, leaned forward from the high tier. The Kurath were compact and densely built, with a stillness to their movements that always reminded Dara of deep water, and this particular council member had not asked a question in 6 days of hearings. When she spoke, her translator rendered the words in measured, careful standard. "You are saying that the capacity for failure is not disqualifying if it is paired with the capacity for correction." Dara said, "Yes, that is exactly what I am saying." The Kurath council member was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And you believe this is a human characteristic, not a human aspiration?" Dara said, "I believe the record is attached." There was a sound from the gallery, not quite laughter, but something that various species translators rendered variously as amusement, recognition, and approval. Even from the Serathi tier, she thought she heard something shift. The vote was on day 11. Each species delegation cast its determination in order of seniority, oldest civilizations first, a tradition that meant the Serathi voted early and the humans, who were not yet voting members, watched from the chamber's observation level. The Serathi voted to deny the petition. No one was surprised. They had filed the challenge. This was the correct and expected outcome. But the challenge required a majority to succeed. If a majority of the council agreed with the Serathi, the petition was denied, and humanity would not be admitted. If a majority voted to admit, the challenge was defeated and the petition approved. The Vithrani voted to admit. Their senior counselor, an ancient individual who had served on the council for 60 years, cast the vote without ceremony, a single deliberate signal that meant yes, and then did not look toward the Serathi delegation. The Kurath voted to admit. The same council member who had asked Dara her question delivered the determination in a statement that was slightly longer than the standard, including a line that translators rendered as, "The argument was well made and the record speaks clearly." Species after species. The chamber was very quiet. Priya was standing next to Dara, not touching her, both of them watching the tally that moved in the display above the chamber well. When the final vote was cast, the margin was not narrow, 14-3. 14 species voted to admit humanity to full membership in the compact. 3, the Serathi and 2 others voted against. 14-3 was not the narrowest possible margin. 14-3 was a statement. Dara stood very still for a moment while the result was confirmed by the chamber's recording system, and the formal determination was rendered official in the compact's archives. A process that took about 4 minutes and felt like considerably longer, and then Priya put a hand on her arm and said, very quietly, "You should probably breathe." Dara breathed. behind her. The rest of the human delegation was doing the thing that humans do when they are trying very hard not to show how they feel in a formal context, which is to say they were doing an extremely poor job of it. 47 people holding themselves with great dignity while their faces did everything that dignity was trying to prevent. Later, in the corridor outside the chamber, Vescalith approached her, the Serathi legal lead, the individual who had more experience before this council than anyone alive, who had filed the challenge and argued it with the full weight of 40,000 years of civilizational confidence. The conversation was brief. The translator handled it adequately. Vescalith said, "Your war clause argument was not what we anticipated." Dara said, "No, I know." Vescalith said, "You reframed the question rather than answering it." Dara said, "I answered the question you actually asked. The document record is what the document record is." There was a pause. The harmonics beneath Vescalith's speech were something the translator didn't try to render, but Dara had spent enough time with Serathi contacts to recognize the quality of it. Not displeasure, not precisely. Something more like recalibration. Vescalith said, "We will be watching your species carefully." Dara said, "We would expect nothing less." The news reached Earth 7 minutes later. It reached the colonies in the cascade that followed, faster-than-light relays carrying the signal outward from Veth Primaris at the speed the Serathi had argued was insufficient, covering the 14 colony worlds in a span of hours. On each world, in each time zone, in each city and settlement and research station and agricultural collective, people received the same message. Humanity had been admitted to the compact. Full members. Not provisional, not observed, not sponsored. Full. The reactions were various because humanity is always various. Some people wept. Some celebrated loudly in the streets. Some sat very quietly and thought about what it meant. Some continued doing what they were doing because that is also a human response to large events. The understanding that the machinery of ordinary life does not pause for history. But the signal moved outward and the worlds received it, and something changed. Dara flew home to Accra 3 weeks after the vote. She had to travel commercial because the diplomatic transport had mechanical issues, and she was not, by nature, someone who insisted on special arrangements. She sat in a window seat. She watched the earth come up below her, the curve of the West African coast, the Gulf of Guinea catching the late afternoon light, the city she'd grown up in spreading inland from the waterfront, ordinary and enormous and entirely itself, unaware that it was being looked at. She had been away for 17 months. She thought about the chambers well and the quiet before she spoke, and the 4 seconds of silence she'd used to let herself feel the weight of the room. She thought about Dr. Akhafer's face when the cultural coherence determination came back in their favor. She thought about Priya saying you should probably breathe. She thought about the shoes. When she landed and walked through the terminal, not in her formal suit, in ordinary clothes, a bag over her shoulder, no delegation behind her, no one recognized her. She was 34 years old and not famous in the way that generated recognition in airports. She moved through the crowd the way people move through crowds, with the practiced unconscious skill of someone who grew up in cities, the constant small negotiations of direction and space. Outside, the evening was warm. It smelled like rain somewhere to the north. The traffic was loud, the particular music of it, horns and engines and voices, that she had missed without knowing she was missing it. She took off her shoes. She stood on the pavement outside the arrivals terminal of Kotoka International Airport in her bare feet, holding the shoes in one hand, and looked up at the sky, which was darkening to purple at its edges and still pale at the center. And somewhere up there, through layers of atmosphere and orbit and vast inhuman distance, the compact's communications relay was already routing the first official transmissions to humanity's new address in the network. One small woman in bare feet in an airport parking lot and 14 votes, and the entire history of a species that had never stopped trying. The stars didn't used to frighten us. They still don't. But now they know our name.